Buried deep within the hushed-back stacks of the Summit Hill Historical Archive, I had just turned a fragile page of a first-edition Federalist Papers, when a voice I knew all too well fractured the stillness. Still playing history buff, Ellie came the unmistakable drawl of my older brother Brandon leaning casually in the doorway with that infuriating grin. Ever thought about doing something that actually exists in the 21st century? I didn't need to look up to know what I'd see Brandon always dressed like a Wall Street cover story. Sure enough, his tailored midnight blue suit clashed jarringly against my soft gray cardigan and worn jeans. The subtle gleam of what was probably a new Patek Philippe watch caught the light of the reading lamp, flaunting its presence like an overconfident handshake. "Brandon," I said, coolly, slipping the aged book back into its climate-controlled cradle. "Didn't expect to see you somewhere without a Bloomberg terminal blinking in the background." He stepped further into the archive, the faint aroma of cologne trailing him like an expensive shadow. His gaze swept across the dusty room like it personally offended his aesthetic sensibilities. "Dad sent me," he announced. "He's worried you'll kill the vibe at their big anniversary party tonight. You know how he gets about optics." I sighed inwardly. Of course. Leave it to my family to think a career in historical preservation was a threat to their social ecosystem. "I'll be there," I replied, rising to meet his gaze. "And don't worry, I'll wear something that won't embarrass the brand." "Good," he replied, flashing that polished investor-facing grin. "I'll be making an announcement tonight. Grace and Equity just finalized the acquisition of 3 tech startups. It's our biggest leap yet." "That's impressive," I said evenly, even as my stomach nodded. He watched me with that familiar blend of smugness and salesmanship. "There's still time to make a pivot," he said, his tone sliding into persuasion. "We've always got room for someone like you in data analytics. At least then you'd be contributing something real." I almost laughed aloud. He had no idea. This modest archive office, it was camouflage. Beneath its quiet surface, I operated Aurora Stratagem, a stealth-mode AI firm already negotiating contracts with defense departments across 2 continents. "I'm doing just fine, Brandon," I said smoothly, walking him toward the door with a professional smile. As soon as he disappeared down the hall, I turned on my heel and slipped back into the real nerve center. To any outsider, my workspace looked like a typical historian's office walls of ancient maps, annotated manuscripts, and framed archival prints. But behind one locked door and a biometric scanner, my custom-built high-sensitivity server system quietly hummed to life. Tonight's headline wouldn't be his. I leaned into the chair as encrypted feeds from Boston, Osaka, and Paris lit up the triple monitor setup. "Good morning, Ms. Grayson," came Jenna's calm voice from one of the screens, her face perfectly lit, despite the time zones. "Neuropulse acquisition packets prepped for final review." "Thanks, Jenna," I murmured, eyes scanning the data. "Legal?" "All clear," she confirmed. "Due diligence wrapped. Ready when you are." I checked the vintage wall clock. Less than 6 hours until the gala. Schedule signing for 8 a.m. tomorrow. Press release for noon sharp. "Already in the pipeline," she said, pausing for a moment. "You sure about the timing?" Brandon's arrogant grin flickered through my mind. I could practically hear his patronizing tone, the echo of a lifetime of dismissal. "Absolutely," I said with a finality that closed the door on doubt. "It's time." Leaning back, I let the low hum of the servers ground me. Aurora Stratagem, known only in cryptic finance circles through nested shell companies, had evolved from a grad school algorithm into a $70 billion titan reshaping global logistics, AI forecasting, and private equity strategies. And my family still thought I spent my days alphabetizing antique letters. I didn't mind. I actually loved the archives. They offered a serenity no trading floor ever could, and they gave me cover. No one suspects the librarian. My phone buzzed, a text from Mom. "Style your hair, the Vaughns will be there." Of course, the Vaughns, the generational wealth darlings Dad was still hoping to impress. I replied with a simple, "will do." I shut down the server and grabbed my bag. First stop, a sleek, ultra-private salon tucked inside a luxury high-rise in River North. Owned discreetly under one of my aliases, naturally. "Tasha," I greeted the stylist as I entered the empty lounge. "Ellie," she beamed. "Let me guess the usual." "Something more formal tonight," I said, lowering myself into the chair. "Big family function." As she worked curling and clipping with practiced ease, I flipped through the final Neuropulse contract on my secure phone. By tomorrow morning, Aurora Stratagem would own the company my brother had spent 12 months chasing in vain. "They still think you're just the bookworm, huh?" Tasha asked, smirking in the mirror. I smiled slowly. For another 12 hours, maybe. Then they'll see what a bookworm can really build. As Tasha twisted the final curl into place, her fingers gentle yet precise, she set the iron aside and casually said, "Your brother was here earlier." She met my eyes in the mirror, her own brimming with quiet mischief. Bragging like a peacock about buying some big tech firm. Sounds huge. I let the corner of my mouth lift into a knowing smile, my expression calm, even serene. "He's trying to buy it," I said, voice soft but edged with steel. "There's a difference." Tasha paused, brow arching as the air between us thickened with unspoken curiosity. She studied my face like she sensed the tension just beneath the surface, the tightly coiled poise that I wore as second skin. "Tomorrow's headlines," I said, my tone, like the first note of a symphony yet to rise, "will be enlightening." 4 hours later, back in my Summit District penthouse, I stood in silence before the tall antique mirror framed in gold filigree, its surface capturing not just a reflection, but the essence of a transformation. The woman staring back at me was no longer the soft-spoken head archivist of the Summit Hill Historical Archive. She was still Elizabeth Grayson, yes, but tonight she was cloaked in the quiet elegance of someone prepared to walk into a room full of billionaires and hold her own. No glasses, no flats, no apology. My gown, a deep navy silk Oscar de la Renta creation, kissed the floor as it moved the fabric heavy with intention and grace. It was a piece that whispered rather than shouted, timeless in silhouette, commanding in detail. My jewelry heirloom South Sea pearls and a discreet Cartier Panthère offered subtle nods to legacy and influence without the garish clamor of new money. In that moment, I looked exactly like the woman my family always wished I would become, someone eager to belong, someone dressed to impress. And yet, beneath the perfectly curated surface, nothing about me conformed to their expectations. I had no need to shout my power. I wore it like armor beneath satin and silk. A soft chime echoed from my phone. "Jenna, everything's finalized. Press release prepped. Want to drop it tonight?" I stared at the screen, then typed back, "No. Let them enjoy the party. Tomorrow is soon enough." The drive to the Grayson estate was short, but my thoughts stretched longer than the roads winding through the gated neighborhood. As I turned onto the long, lamp-lit driveway, my black Audi A6 glided between rows of imported cars. Bentleys, Teslas, Aston Martins, each polished to a mirror, shine lined up like sentinels of power and opulence. I parked in the shadows, classic, unremarkable. Just librarian enough not to raise a brow. The front doors opened before I could knock. "Welcome home, Miss Ellie," said Roy, our family's butler of 25 years. His warm voice wrapped in formality and a trace of affection. "Your parents are in the main hall." Inside, the estate glowed with curated extravagance. Baccarat crystal tinkled beneath the melody of a live string quartet. Conversations floated on polished laughter and the scent of French cologne. This was old money at its most ceremonial, where appearances were sacred and status was currency. "Elizabeth, darling," my mother's voice rang out across the room, smooth and clipped. "You look presentable." From Margaret Grayson, this was as close to praise as a meteor to earth. At 65, she wore luxury like armor, her lavender silk gown tailored to perfection, her diamond earrings swinging like judgments beneath the chandeliers. She was poised, radiant, and unyielding. "Happy anniversary, Mom," I said, leaning in to kiss her carefully powdered cheek. "Your father's by the fireplace," she replied, already pivoting toward a cluster of guests she deemed more valuable than her only daughter. "Try not to disappear into the library just yet." I threaded my way through the room, weaving between air kisses and the featherlight insults wrapped in sweet tones. "Oh, still at the archive," one guest cooed. "That's just so charming." How devoted, another sighed. "Books and dusty old history, how very you." I smiled graciously, nodding like porcelain. They had no idea. By sunrise, their world would feel just a touch less certain, a fraction more fragile. "There's my girl," my father bellowed from beside the grand hearth, his voice cutting through the room like a celebratory cannon. Charles Grayson, silver-haired and statuesque, towered over his circle of old golf buddies and foundation chairs. His tailored tux barely contained the bravado of a man still convinced he ruled the city. He pulled me in for a hug, his breath thick with aged whiskey. "Still digging through those dusty scrolls, huh?" He chuckled loud enough for Gregory Vaughan, one of his cronies, to catch. "Still preserving knowledge for future generations," I replied with a smile as smooth as silk, my tone just a few shades off demure. Their laughter followed light and dismissive, the sound of men too secure in their assumptions to question their arrogance. Speaking of the future, my father boomed, swelling with pride. "Where's Brandon? He's got something big to share." And as if cued by a celestial spotlight, Brandon Grayson entered. His presence was thunderous. Champagne in hand, tuxedo, perfect smile, sharper than the diamond cufflinks that winked from his sleeves. "Everyone," he said, lifting his glass-high voice like a maestro calling an orchestra to attention. The room fell silent, the energy sharpening. "As most of you know, Grayson Equity has been expanding at a phenomenal pace," he began, each word soaked in calculated confidence. "And tonight, I'm proud to announce we are on the brink of our boldest acquisition yet. By next week, we expect to finalize the purchase of Neuropulse Technologies." A wave of murmurs and applause rippled through the crowd, soft gasps, impressed nods. I saw our father's chest swell like a general receiving medals. My mother's eyes welled with well-timed emotion. They were basking in it. "It's not inked just yet," Brandon continued, always the salesman. "But we're there. Paperwork's ready. Legal has blessed it. It's ours in all but name." Dad slapped his back. "That's my boy." And then, inevitably, Brandon's eyes found mine across the sea of sequins and celebratory smirks. To my little sister, he called, lifting his glass in my direction, "Still reading about history while we go out and make it." "Ready to admit you took the wrong path, Ellie." I didn't blink. "I think," I replied, letting the weight of each word settle like dust on old vellum. "You shouldn't count your acquisitions before they clear regulatory." He laughed, but the edge of it was off-brittle. Still speaking in riddles, he muttered, the smile faltering just for a moment. "That's why you'll always be where you are, reading about greatness instead of achieving it." "Perhaps," I said quietly, raising my glass. "But at least I do my due diligence." I saw it hit him, the way his jaw twitched, the forced grin faltered. Brandon always hated when I used language like that, measured, accurate, irrefutable. It reminded him in subtle, infuriating ways that I wasn't nearly as naive as he needed me to be. "Due diligence," he repeated, sneering just slightly. "I've got the best legal team in the business. Everything's tight, buttoned up." I raised my champagne flute and tapped it gently against his, my smile the epitome of polite dismissal. "Well then," I said softly, "I suppose we'll both see in the morning." His brow furrowed for half a breath, uncertainty flickering before he could suppress it. But before the silence could curdle into suspicion, my mother's voice rang out, elegant and commanding, "Dinner is served." The moment dissolved, swept away by the rising rustle of designer gowns and murmured conversation as the guests began migrating toward the dining room. It was a symphony of movement, the swish of silks, the clink of glasses, and the low hum of anticipation. I lingered briefly on the threshold, watching the scene unfold. Beneath the opulence, the carved mahogany, the vintage crystal, the curated ambiance of old American aristocracy, I sensed the fragile balance of the room. And I knew by tomorrow the center of gravity would shift. As I followed the line of guests into the room, I found my seat tucked at the far end of the long, gleaming table. It was a minor detail, a whisper of strategic placement, but deliberate all the same. The message was clear: ornamental, not essential. Across the vast table, Brandon was in his element. Crowned in laughter, gesturing with flourish, he played the part of the heir apparent with practiced ease. Every toast, every compliment, every approving nod from a Vaughn or a Llewellyn only buoyed him higher. I smiled when required, offering polite nods while turning my focus to the rosemary duck on my plate, a welcome distraction in a room that echoed with condescension, dressed as charm. To my left, Eleanor Vaughn leaned closer, her platinum hair gleaming like spun silver under the chandelier. Her voice, smooth and lightly perfumed with practiced concern, slipped into my ear. "You were always so bright, Elizabeth," she said with the air of someone bestowing an honorific. "Everyone thought you'd do something extraordinary. Why waste all that on old books?" I let the question settle in the air like a speck of dust floating in a sunbeam before I responded. "Books teach more than history," I said. "They teach us how to read between the lines, how to recognize patterns others overlook." She blinked, not unkindly, but with the sort of bemusement reserved for a child who says something clever at dinner. "Well," she sighed, "at least your brother is doing something that matters. It must be hard watching him shine." Her words might have cut me once years ago, but tonight they only brushed the surface. "It's not as difficult as you might think," I replied with a smile as soft as velvet, returning my gaze to the candlelit centerpiece. The meal flowed on course after elegant course with the usual blend of social barbs sheathed in expensive banter. Passive praise. Disguised disapproval. A familial sport refined over decades. Eventually, as dessert arrived, a trio of flourless chocolate cake raspberry coulis and caramel tart, Brandon rose once more, glass raised high. The room hushed in reflex. To Mom and Dad, he said, his voice warm and honeyed. Who taught me what it means to win? And to my sister Ellie, who reminds us all that success takes many forms, some louder than others. The laughter that followed was polite, even affectionate, but it held an edge, a slight sharpness, that had become the soundtrack of my family's view of me. I lifted my glass as well, though my thoughts were already elsewhere on the press release scheduled for 8:00 a.m., the servers poised to deploy it across every major financial outlet in the world. Later, as I stood by the dessert table sipping a rich cafe espresso, Brandon found me again. His energy was still electric, the afterglow of his announcement burning in his eyes like stage lights. "Enjoying yourself?" he asked, adjusting his cufflinks with theatrical flair. "It's a lovely evening," I replied, savoring the warmth of the coffee. "I'm sure our parents are thrilled." "They are," he said with a grin. "Would have been even better if both their kids had built something impressive." I reached for a dark chocolate truffle, turning it delicately between my fingers. "You know, Brandon, I said success isn't always about who shouts the loudest." He scoffed. "Tell that to my portfolio. What does a librarian even make these days?" I glanced down at the Louis Vuitton heels peeking from beneath my gown. "Enough to afford these," I replied with a subtle arch of my brow. "I've always been good with investments." He emptied his champagne in one long swallow, then checked his phone. "Well," he said, tucking it away, "this has been enlightening. But I've got people to impress, and a company to acquire." As he swaggered off drunk on his own inevitability, I reached into my clutch and slid out my secure phone. My fingers danced across the screen. "Everything ready for tomorrow," I texted. Jenna replied almost instantly. "All systems go. Press release locked for 8:00. Want the final numbers?" "No need," I replied, the corners of my mouth tugging upward. "I'll read them in the headlines alongside everyone else." Midnight came, and with it the slow unraveling of the evening. I moved gracefully through my goodbyes, weathering the final volleys of backhanded compliments with practiced grace. "You really should consider Brandon's offer," my mother whispered, her tone clipped as she kissed my cheek. "A corporate librarian role would be perfect for you." "I'll think about it," I murmured with a soft smile. "I wouldn't," I added under my breath. The car ride home was quiet, the city lights painting gold streaks across the windshield as I considered the threshold I was about to cross. For 8 years I had lived in the shadow cast by expectation. The eccentric daughter, the quiet one, the bookworm, but in a few hours everything would tilt. At precisely 7 a.m., I slipped through the side entrance of the Summit Hill Historical Archive, my flats tapping a quiet rhythm against the marble floor. To the world, I was still the unassuming director of a public institution, nothing out of the ordinary. Becky Lynn was already there, tablet in hand, her blonde ponytail pulled tight. To staff, she was assistant archivist. In reality, she was Aurora Stratagem's COO. "All prepped," she said, stepping into my office. "Osaka's on standby, press release queued." I set down my bag and powered up my laptop, the secure connection springing to life. "Any movement from Brandon's team?" "They're prepped and puffed up," she said with a wry grin. "Still convinced they've got neuropulse in the bag." "Let's give them a few more minutes," I said, smiling. Blissful ignorance has its charm. At exactly 7:15 a.m., my encrypted line lit up. "Ms. Grayson," came the translator's smooth voice. "The neuropulse board is assembled and ready." "Excellent," I replied. "Let's begin." What followed was swift, clean, and final contracts, e-signed approvals, confirmed seals authenticated. By 8:00 a.m., Aurora Stratagem officially owned Neuropulse Technologies, its patents, its pipeline, its global infrastructure, all of it. "Press release is live," Jenna confirmed. I opened my browser and watched the world shift. Librarian no more. Elizabeth Grayson acquires Neuropulse Technologies in $4.2 billion power move. The mystery buyer unmasked. Aurora Stratagem reveals its founder. Wall Street stunned by stealth empire behind game-changing AI deal. My phone vibrated furiously, a symphony of news alerts, texts, and phone calls crashing through the still air like a digital tsunami. It was only a matter of time. The very first call, of course, came from Brandon. No pleasantries, no preamble, just a storm of disbelief barely contained behind clenched teeth. "What the hell is this?" His voice cracked across the line like a whip, brittle and combustible, steeped in fury he barely knew how to aim. "Good morning to you too, brother." I said evenly, lifting my porcelain espresso cup and savoring the warmth against my palm as I glanced at the rising skyline through my office window. I take it you've read the headlines. This is a joke, he hissed. Aurora Stratagem. You're not the founder. I am, I said simply. Have been for 8 years. I let the silence stretch between us, allowing the weight of those words to settle like sediment. I understand the confusion, I continued, my voice laced with gentle irony. After all, I'm just the bookworm, right? The other end of the line erupted with noisepapers flapping, muffled shouting, the chaos of a man unraveling. Brandon was scrambling, piecing together fragments of a reality he never saw coming. But I had a deal, he barked. Contract signatures, it was all in place. Is it? I asked, letting a touch of mock innocence bleed into my tone. You might want to read the fine print. We've been negotiating with Neuropulse for months. So have we... My team, I interrupted, each pause, deliberate, each word, a scalpel, my company, my empire. His breathing faltered on the line. The one I built while you were too busy mocking my career, reducing it to trivia, to footnotes in dusty books. And then silence. A second passed, then a third. And with a sharp click, he hung up. Across the office, Jenna tried and failed to hide the amused curl of her lips. How long until the next explosion, she asked, already bracing herself. I didn't have to guess. Right on cue, my mother's name lit up the screen, vibrating with the unmistakable energy of righteous panic. Elizabeth Grayson, she barked the moment I answered, her voice sharp as broken glass. What in the world have you done? Good morning, Mother, I said sweetly, reclining back into my chair as if this were any other Tuesday. I'm a bit buried in meetings, but we can always catch up over dinner. Dinner, she nearly shrieked. Do you have any idea the chaos you've caused? Your father's phone is blowing up. The Vaughns, the board, the media. Everyone's asking how our librarian daughter just bought Neuropulse. In the background, I could hear my father barking orders like a general on a battlefield, flipping between calls demanding updates that wouldn't arrive fast enough. Tell her to get over here now, he shouted. I'm booked all day, I replied truthfully, but I'd be happy to host tonight. Say 6:00. There was a pause. Suspicion crept into her voice like frost on glass. You mean that little apartment near the archive? No, I replied, my smile spreading slowly as I composed the address in a text. I mean my penthouse. Summit Tower. 75 Caldwell Avenue. The silence on her end turned into a vacuum. Caldwell Avenue, she echoed, the disbelief nearly choking her. But that's the most expensive building in the city. Is it? I said lightly. I hadn't noticed. See you at 6, Mom. I ended the call and exhaled the breath, catching in my throat as 8 years of silence, subterfuge, and sacrifice cracked open and poured into the light. My reflection stared back at me from the dark screen of my laptop, composed, collected, utterly changed. Behind me, Jenna's voice was calm, but charged with anticipation. Ready for Phase 3. I gave a nod that carried the weight of a decade. Do it. Within minutes, the second press release detonated across global media. Not just a follow-up to the Neuropulse deal, but a declaration. A merger months in the making, meticulously negotiated with 3 of the most elite innovation firms across Seoul, Singapore, and Tokyo, strategically announced mere hours after our acquisition became public. This was no coincidence. This was chess. It wasn't luck. It was legacy. And this time it bore my name. The rest of the day unfolded in a tightly wound orchestration of meetings, media coordination, and international calls. A check-in with our legal counsel. A strategic consultation with our partners in Tokyo. A discreet exclusive interview with a Wall Street Journal reporter whose voice crackled with disbelief. A background in archival science, he asked. It teaches you to manage chaos, I replied with a measured smile. To curate clarity from a flood of noise. Information is power. It always has been. By 7:10 p.m., I exited the quiet back entrance of the archive, the place I had so long used as cover, and stepped into the black town car waiting to return me to my real life. My real home. The penthouse at the top of Summit Tower, a crystalline fortress suspended above the city, cloaked in silence and security. I had lived there for 6 years, hidden in plain sight while maintaining a modest studio to keep up the librarian illusion. Inside that glass-encased haven, surrounded by high-speed infrastructure and encrypted networks, I had built the backbone of an empire. I had controlled billions in assets-shaped markets, directed intelligence, and no one knew. At exactly 6:00 p.m., the private elevator chimed. Brandon stepped out first. He looked shaken, disoriented in a way I'd never seen. The polish was still there. He was too proud to let it go completely, but his edges were fraying. His swagger had softened into something brittle. Behind him, my mother entered, eyes wide, lips parted as if she'd stepped into a mirage. My father followed, silent and taut, a man recalibrating a world he thought he understood. Even Roy, our old family butler, who had always kept his composure, looked as though someone had whispered a scandal in his ear. "Welcome to my home," I said, gesturing toward the panoramic view where the lake shimmered beneath the early dusk lights of the city, flickering on like stars breaking through cloud. Brandon's voice cut the air, tight, flat. "How long?" I moved to the bar, poured myself a finger of scotch, and turned with deliberate grace. "How long have I been lying?" I clarified, lifting the glass. "I haven't. Everything I told you has been true. I am a librarian. I do love books. I just also happen to run a global financial empire." But why, my mother asked, her voice barely a whisper now. She sank onto the edge of a pale Italian leather sofa, like someone who had misplaced gravity. "Why keep it from us? Why let us believe you were a failure?" I placed a crystal tumbler filled with elderflower tonic gently in front of her. "Maybe because you never looked past the story you preferred to tell," I said, locking eyes with her. "You saw a daughter who chose quiet over conquest, one who turned away from the family's legacy. But silence isn't weakness, it's strategy." My father had moved to the window, hands clasped behind his back, the skyline reflected in the glass like a constellation. All this time, he murmured, "Those anonymous investors, the shell firms, that was you." Brandon's voice was hollow now. "You're the mystery buyer," he said, "the one who kept outbidding us, the ghost we couldn't trace. You're the one who's been reshaping the market." I allowed myself a quiet smile. "I prefer knowledge empire. After all," I said, "isn't that what you always told me growing up, Dad?" "Knowledge is power." The phrase lingered in the air like a benediction as my father finally turned to face me. Not with disapproval, not with confusion, but with something heavier and infinitely more complex, a dawning recognition, as if he were seeing me for the very first time, not as an errant daughter, but as a force, as someone he could respect. "The Neuropulse deal." Brandon asked, his voice slower now, almost reverent. "How long have you been working on that?" 8 months publicly, I said, letting the truth fall between us like coins on marble. But I've had controlling interests in their key subsidiaries for over a year. I watched his pupils contract, saw understanding bloom with a touch of betrayal. "You've been playing me," he whispered. "Not playing," I said gently, though there was nothing soft in the truth I offered him. "Competing. Isn't that what you always wanted? A real fight, a genuine test of business acumen, something worthy of legacy." "It wasn't fair," he snapped, his voice cracking under the weight of defiance. "You had inside access, teams, networks I didn't even know existed." I let out a breath that was half sigh, half laugh, the sound curling through the air of the penthouse like distant thunder. "You mean like the insider tips you gather over glasses of vintage port on yachts, or the whispered strategies shared between golf holes and charity galas?" I set my drink down with a soft clink, letting the silence linger. "No, Brandon. I didn't cheat. I didn't steal. I didn't ride coattails or family names. I built this, all of it, with research, with precision, with strategy. Every risk measured, every move orchestrated. This empire wasn't handed to me. It was earned, brick by digital brick." I looked from him to my parents, letting the truth wash over them like a tidal surge, years of assumptions collapsing under the weight of what had always been there, waiting to be seen. Dinner that evening unfolded like a storm behind glass, muted, tense, but undeniably transformative. My mother kept glancing around the room as if trying to decode the language of my wealth, the original art, the minimalist decor, the silence of expensive appliances. My father remained quiet, lost in private calculations, his mind replaying conversations and decisions through this new lens. Even Brandon, once so loudly confident, sat subdued, no longer the peacock, but a man reevaluating the battlefield. Eventually, he broke the silence. "So, what's next?" I turned to meet his gaze. "A partnership." His brow lifted, caught somewhere between disbelief and intrigue. "Your firm," I continued, "needs global integration, not just legacy power. You need vision beyond domestic plays and old names. I'm offering that." To my surprise, my father nodded slowly, as if the last piece of some invisible puzzle had finally fallen into place. "Maybe," he said, "it's time you learned from her." As dessert arrived, the atmosphere shifted again. The quiet librarian, once ignored, had become the future they couldn't afford to overlook. Brandon, ever the tactician, now found himself searching for my lead, not because he had to, but because he finally understood that I was worth following. By the time we found ourselves in the kitchen leaning over early drafts of a proposal document, his skepticism had melted into something more tentative, an admiration not yet admitted but growing nonetheless. "I underestimated you," he said, tapping the counter with nervous fingers, "but I'm not making that mistake again." Later, as coats were gathered and goodbyes exchanged, my mother lingered behind her eyes softer than I could remember. "Why now, Ellie?" she asked. Her voice was no longer clipped. It trembled with something closer to vulnerability. "Why choose tonight to reveal all of this?" I thought for a long moment before answering. "Because the world needs to see that success doesn't always look like what they expect. It doesn't always wear a watch that costs more than a semester at Yale. Sometimes," I said, lifting my chin with quiet pride, "it wears cardigans and carries a library card." To my surprise, Brandon added from behind her, "And maybe it's a reminder not to judge people by their wardrobe." When they left, I stood with Jenna by the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city beyond us shimmered with light, alive and listening. "Stocks are already moving," she murmured, her eyes scanning her tablet. "Analysts are calling the merger visionary." I nodded, but my mind was elsewhere. The formal announcement was still days away. Brandon might take a little longer to accept the full partnership to process the power shift, but the seed had been planted. Tonight hadn't been about victory. It had been about truth. A quiet reckoning where my family's perception of me, and my own, finally aligned. My mother's tearful apology, my father's thoughtful gaze. They meant something. For once, I wasn't just accepted, I was understood. The next morning, I walked into the Summit Hill Historical Archive as I always had. Nothing had changed. The regulars waved, the interns buzzed with questions about the upcoming exhibit. No one whispered about Forbes. No one asked about Neuropulse. And that, to me, was the real triumph. Because in a world obsessed with spectacle, I had built something resilient, not just with wealth, but with wisdom. I was still Elizabeth Grayson, still the librarian, still in love with dusty books and quiet rooms. But I was also the founder of a multi-billion-dollar global empire. And the beauty of it, I never had to choose between the two, because knowledge wears many faces, and sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one you never thought to notice. If my story resonates with you even just a little, I want to hear yours. What are you building? What dream are you quietly protecting? What fire have you kept hidden, waiting for your own moment to rise? You matter, and your story, it's more powerful than you think. If this journey lit a spark in you or reminded you of your own quiet strength, take a moment to like this video, not for the algorithm, but as a quiet nod that says I'm here too. And if you want to walk with me into what comes next, into the blueprints, the battles, the breakthroughs, then go ahead and subscribe. Not because you need to, but because you deserve a place where quiet ambition is seen, heard, and celebrated.